Okay, hello everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, your host for the Cosmos Society online open house series. And our guest today is a familiar face, Laura Slatkin of NYU and senior fellow at the center. Let's see, you're going to talk with us today, Laura, about your experience teaching the classics in the prison setting.
Yes.
And I'll just let you begin, I guess.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's always wonderful to be with you in the open house. And thank you to Janet and Sarah and Ellen. Yes, when Janet asked whether I might be interested in talking about something I was working on, I thought it might be of interest to tell you something about the experiences that I had teaching a couple of courses at a men's medium security. Now they've slightly upped the security level, but essentially sort of high, medium security correctional facility in New York State. It's about 70 miles north of the city. And I team taught actually with a friend of mine who has connections to the Center for Hellenic Studies, and her wonderful book on Theocritus is on the center website, and that's Amy Johnson, who was part of the Columbia prison programs. I was part of the NYU prison program, but there was a collaboration so that we could teach together. Amy is an old friend from graduate school. When we thought about, I was approached by the prison program to see whether, there would be a course that would be useful for the program. And so I talked to Amy, and we thought we'd like to do something on epic, on Homeric epic. And we asked a colleague of mine who had taught in the program the previous year whether he thought it would be appropriate to teach the Iliad, for example. And he said, oh, yes, he thought that would be very successful because it's about honor. And so he is a political theorist, not a classicist, but he said, yes, he thought that would work well. And so we decided we would do some selections from the Iliad and some selections from the Odyssey. And I mean, at first we thought of it as, two old white women and Homer walk into a prison. It was like one of these, bar jokes.
They're going to be a punchline. Right.
But it became this absolutely absorbing kind of collaboration with the students, and really a very inspiring kind of experience of seeing people coming to grips with material that was unfamiliar to them, but that they really became very absorbed by. And I'll show you at the end some comments that they made. One, just to give you one in advance, one of the students at the end of our second class, actually, our second course, which was on Greek tragedy, and the students gave us some notes at the end, which I'll tell you more about later. But one of them said, and you'll see this, he said, "Thank you. Learning took place. I would have never thought that ancient Greek mythology could be relevant in today's world, but it very much is." So
that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. And so so there was there was a kind of spirit of engagement and discovery and so forth, that was really thrilling. And you know, it's a complicated project, the prison education project, um, because you sometimes meet with some resistance from the prison um,
Mm.
staff. And uh, we were very fortunate that in this facility, the superintendent, who was a woman, was sympathetic to the program. And so, that meant a lot. But it was but it was often, there was often some resistance from for instance, the prison guards. And some of them said, frankly, these people are getting about the students, these people are getting a college education and I don't have one, or my kid doesn't have one, and so forth. So there
Mhm.
was a certain amount of um, effort, made. And what I think and hope is that it will be possible to offer classes for the prison staff if they're interested. I'm hoping the program can be expanded in that direction, or for their
Right,
kids,
right.
for that matter. But
I'm
but
wondering,
yeah,
as a teacher, if you could describe how you ran the class with your co-teacher Amy Johnson. Was it kind of lecturing? Was it close reading and discussion? What kinds of things did you do?
it was mostly close reading and discussion. We gave some historical background and we gave some context. I mean, if you teach the Oresteia, there's a lot of backstory,
Hmm.
that you have to offer. So there was a lot of using of the board and giving handouts. They have no access to the internet, so
Okay.
they can't Google things. Uh, and that may be changing now in a limited way, but in at that time, and the last course that we taught was last fall, um, and we're hoping to teach again next fall if everything opens up and is safe. But so we brought material, and when you bring material into the facility, everything has to be examined. We had to
Mm.
open all our bags and backpacks and this and that and show everything, and they give you a kind of clear, a sort of a large folder to put your papers in and your books in and so forth. You can't bring a cell phone into the facility. I mean, there are a lot of restrictions. And when we had an orientation at the beginning before we started, and this was not long after when we started. It was not long after there had been a prison break in Dannemora, in upstate New York, with these two two inmates who had um, become friendly with a worker in the prison, a woman, and she had sort of facilitated their prison break. So this was very much on everybody's minds. I mean, the minds of the prison staff when we came. And our orientation, was all about, they showed us a film and so forth, and it was really about how we should be on guard against being manipulated by the students, and I have to say, I mean, we never had one moment of concern about that, when we when we met the students and talked to them, and you know, and when they got involved in the material, and they would often say, you know, this, um, you know, this was something that brought them together also, um, you know, as a group. So they weren't really, they weren't, you know, no one was trying, in a sense, to have a sort of separate relationship with us, you know, and it was really very much a collective thing. And so, but really, in answer to your question, Keith, yes, it was really close reading. We looked at passages, we read them out loud um, in the Homer course, especially, and well, both courses really, and we talked about them. We asked them, um, you know, what their sense was uh, of the way the poems unfolded, and they had they were very much uh, you know, very curious about the Iliad, very fascinated, and they were not anymore um, put off, as it were, by strange names and place names and so forth than, you know, our undergraduates are. You know, and uh, yeah, and we would ask them every week. So it met every once a week, and we asked them to write a short paper. And either we would give them a question or we would give them a passage and say, what's important about this passage? What's significant about it? What questions does it raise? You know, what's going on, and so forth. And you know, these were, it was challenging, you know, for the students, but they did it with great, um, you know, great commitment. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, while the Iliad was fascinating to them, it was really the Odyssey that they felt spoke to them very much, because, you know, these were people who hadn't seen their families, some of them in
Right.
hadn't been home, at any rate, to see their families, some of them in years.
Right.
Um,
Which parts of the Odyssey did you choose for them? You said you chose selections from these texts.
Selections, yeah. I mean, um, we did quite a bit about Odysseus and Telemachus, but we also had them read Book 5, Calypso, and Odysseus's, you know, refusal of staying with Calypso, and we did, and then we did concentrated quite a lot on the homecoming, on the last half of the poem. But um, but we, in the second time we taught, when we taught some Greek, some, you know, Athenian tragedy, uh, we also taught, you know, offered them some reimaginings or adaptations um,
Mm-hmm.
of the plays, and that was very thrilling. I mean, one of the things that we learned, which, you know, I mean, there were things that we were surprised by that we shouldn't have been surprised by, but one of them was that no one in the class, in that tragedy class, had ever actually seen a play staged, except something that had been put on at the prison, but they'd never actually been to the theater.
Mm-hmm.
So we also made use of, you know, brought in some CDs and DVDs and so forth of performances and stagings, and with the Homer course, we showed them a DVD of part of a Thin Red Line and some other sort of Homer inflected, war films. Amy Johnson, my co-pilot on this course, was much more sort of up to date on film and video kinds of reimaginings of the Homeric material, but with the tragedy course, there are some truly spectacular adaptations, and I learned a lot, from thinking about those with the students. And for example, I don't know whether you are familiar with this wonderful adaptation of Antigone by Athol Fugard, the South African playwright, a play called The Island. So do you know it, Kelly? Is that,
I've heard of it. I haven't
you read it? Yeah, they put it on at BAM.
Okay.
It's probably 20 years ago, something like that. And then there was a sort of revival of it. It's a very brilliant play that I recommend, with, complete kind of enthusiasm. And it's two prisoners. It's set in a prison. On Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned all those years, and the prisoners, these two cellmates who are imprisoned for having torn up their passbooks or burned their passbooks, decide to put on Antigone for their fellow inmates. And so it's really, the play is about it's in part, shows their grappling with Antigone, with Sophocles' Antigone. And one of the inmates knows it and the other one doesn't. And the one who does know the play is going to play King Creon, and the other one, and he assigns to the other one the part of Antigone. And the guy who's assigned the part of Antigone says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not a woman. I'm not going to play a woman's part, and has to be convinced to do it. Well, what was extraordinary was that when we were teaching Sophocles' Antigone, before we got to the adaptations, we went around the room and we would have them read out loud, just going around the room. We sat in a kind of circle around a table, and when we got to one of the students, and it was Antigone's, passage that Antigone speaks, he said, this was before we ever looked at the Fugard play, he, immediately said, no, I'm not going to read that. I'm not a woman. And we said, whoa, wait until you see this play next week. Wait until we read this play next week, and you'll recognize that. And so so I think, and we also had, there's a very, also very stunning reimagining of Sophocles' Ajax. We read the Ajax and then read a play by the playwright, contemporary playwright Ellen McLaughlin, who has done a series uh, of, so to speak, adaptations of she has a book called The Greek Plays, and she has a wonderful, wonderful play called Ajax in Iraq, set in the early days of the Iraq War, and the Ajax figure is a woman called AJ, who is sexually assaulted, is raped by her commanding officer, and has a kind of complete breakdown, and you know, kills animals the way Ajax in Sophocles' Ajax does, and then winds up committing suicide. It's a really deeply, you know, moving and really very, very brilliant play. And so they loved it, and the guys, you know, were tremendously enthusiastic about it, and some of them had they had not been in the military themselves, but they knew people who had. They thought about you know, possible you know, future you know, some kind of future participation in the military and so on. And the whole thing was really very, you know, stimulating to them as a way of thinking about what the kinds of, you know, strengths and limitations of, you know, life in the military might involve. And they liked the Fugard play too, but it was interesting. They didn't, what we realized was they didn't really know the history of apartheid. And so at first they were rather puzzled by the play, and they didn't quite understand in the setting and what were the men doing there and so forth in prison. And then when we gave them some background material on it, they then they were, you know, really in the grip of it. So these were some of the things that we covered. There's a wonderful adaptation of Oedipus the King by Luis Alfaro, and it's called Oedipus El Rey, and it's set in the gang culture of East Central LA, and has this very illuminating way of making clear the kind of thing that that always puzzles people about the question of, you know, destiny and what it means that and I see Bill's question, how many students? So there were about 17 or 18 in one class, about 20 in the other. But just to say about the Alfaro thing, what he does is he dramatizes a guy who is in a gang, gets into a fight, gets into prison, you know, finally is released from prison, but goes back into the gang, right? And then goes back into prison. And when he's in prison, he meets the leader of another gang, an older man whom he doesn't recognize, and they have a fight and he kills him, and it turns out to be, of course, his father, but he doesn't know that. But it's this business of the endless loop of gang to prison and prison back to the gang and gang back, so that you never get out of it. And this was Alfaro's representation of that, that notion of a kind of, what you're sort of destined for, that you can't get away from. And so, representing it as something that is actually part of a, as it were, of a social and political structure, not a kind of, mysterious, somehow
Theological
from
construction of
beyond.
fate.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
really, it's wonderful. I saw it. They did it at the Public Theater maybe four or 5 years ago, and I think you can actually see it on YouTube. And I greatly recommend it. And he did a version of Sophocles' Electra called Electricidad that I think is also on YouTube. But maybe I will show you a couple of things. Keith had asked me, were there ways in which the students read material that surprised us? And there were. And so maybe I'll show you Sarah, if you want to try yeah. So we might go just, yeah, great. So we might go just to the next slide. Oh yeah, so this is just to say we used, what I used here for translation was Lattimore's Iliad, just to show you these passages. But we actually didn't teach from this translation. We taught from a translation by Stanley Lombardo, which is more sort of colloquial and contemporary in its diction and so forth. I've always liked Lattimore because it's, it's close to the text, and it has, it has a kind of dignity and, and accuracy, and it sort of goes line by line. It keeps the same lineation, but it's now much less accessible to students because it has a kind of, it seems sort of old-fashioned. So we wanted something that wouldn't be, as it were, alienating to them, and hard to kind of get through. So we used a more contemporary and colloquial version. Lombardo's was published in 2000, and Lattimore, I think, first in the 60s, something like that. So do you guys have a preferred translation? Of course, the one that's on the CHS website, I just couldn't extract it. I didn't have the skills to extract it to make a.
Yeah, in fact, this community has contributed to that translation. So it's.
Pardon?
This community has contributed to that translation. So
well, it's
definitely
wonderful.
Our favorite.
But. That's your favorite. Well, it's wonderful. And, in my next incarnation, when I know more about how to make PowerPoint things, I would certainly use it. But this was from Lattimore. No, I love those things that are in the source book. So just the next slide will just to let me see if, yeah. So they had read through book 16, and they had read this passage about, the passage of the death of Patroclus, and Hector in these lines that are sort of, 8:30 and following, Hector standing over, thank you, standing over Patroclus and saying, you thought you were going to do us in, but, what a fool, Napios. you know, and Achilles couldn't do anything to help you, and so forth. The whole, that
Mhm.
whole, scarifying speech over poor Patroclus, as he's dying. So we had read through this, and then in the next class we read, and you can just maybe go to the next one, Sarah. Yeah, and so in 22, I mean, this is the passage that that you all know so well too. If you go just down to the bottom here, at 136, and the shivers took hold of Hector when he saw him, and he could no longer stand his ground there, but left the gates behind and fled, frightened. And to Amy and me, we were sort of kind of speechless with the sorrow of this, and the kind of pathos of it and so forth. And when we read it out loud, the students burst out laughing, and we were totally taken aback and couldn't believe it. And we said, well, what are you laughing for? And this is so sad. And they said, well, Hector boasted that he was going to, and they went back to the book 16 passage, and said he could kill Achilles and so forth. He boasted, and he couldn't live up to it, and so forth. And so, and we said, yes, but look, and so forth. But they couldn't, they absolutely, felt that this was, Hector was sort of getting what he deserved for having made that boast over the dying Patroclus. Janet is asking, how did the students decide? Well, we sent a syllabus, and we sent a kind, sort of course description, and it was entirely their choice. There were a few other courses being taught that semester, and some of them were in more than one class, but the choice is absolutely up to them. So, and the prison program has a staff, and they have they're wonderful and very, of course, dedicated folks who are, who are responsible for organizing and there's a kind of admissions process. They interview the students, so not everybody is actually admitted to this program, and they will, if they complete it successfully, they'll have an AA degree, an associate's degree, and can then go on to, when they are released, they can go on to, to another,
This
BA.
transferable credit.
Yeah, and they have the credits for that. And I was telling Keith that one of our students graduated from this program and was admitted at Rutgers. And he was someone we taught in the Homer course. And he just this past May graduated from Rutgers. So, and there are now a number of students who are enrolled in BA programs in the city. I mean, they have to observe their the conditions of their parole, so they can't go just anywhere. You know, but we have one who was in the tragedy class last year who now is going to a college. He graduated, he was released, and he is going to a college in California. And it was interesting because he's actually from the Bronx, and he said to us that he wanted to go away, even though he really would have liked to stay in New York, and his mother is in New York, but he wanted to get far away because he was afraid he would return to the gang. Mm-hmm. So he was able to go to California because he has a brother there. And there are some who are students at NYU who are BA students at NYU now, you know, who have graduated from the program. But I think the thing I really want to say is that, you know, what you see, you know, is, I mean, you know, it's a sort of desire, you know, to read, the desire, you know, to talk, you know, and they would often say, you know, for instance, that we had a week off for Thanksgiving, and they said, oh, you know, we're going to miss the class, and, you know, this is a highlight of the week. And, you know, and I think in a way it was, you know, and they had lots of questions, you know, and they really wanted to think about this stuff. So I think what I would want to really emphasize, you know, is the kind of spirit, you know, of thoughtfulness, of curiosity, of, you know, nobody tried to kind of not, you know, sort of short circuit anything, or, you know, they did their papers. And there was one assignment that we had that was really very fruitful, which was that after reading some of these adaptations, there's also a great one, very short play, again, a kind of adaptation of Antigone, or a sort of rethinking of Antigone, by a playwright called Tanya Barfield, a play called Medallion, about a Black woman during World War I who wants to get the medallion that her brother earned fighting in the war, and he was killed in the war, and she wants the medallion, and of course the troops then were segregated, and she goes to see a kind of military commander, and he says, I can't help you. And she says, but I want something of my brother's, and so forth. And he's condescending, and, you know, so forth, and refuses. It's a wonderful kind of really heartrending play. And we asked the students if they would take any of the plays and write the missing scene. You know, if they would imagine a scene either write the final scene? If they, did they think that there could be an additional scene, additional exchange, or to write a scene somewhere in the middle of the play, any of them? And that that produced some really extraordinary writing. And so one of the things that we're going to try to do in the program is have more creative writing courses, because
Laura, may I ask, based on your experience teaching these students, has that changed in any way the way you teach your, if you like, academic students at university?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there isn't, it's not so different in a way. That's the thing. I mean, one thing that we really felt with these students was one doesn't have to try to motivate them. They are motivated, and sometimes with undergraduates, they're there because it's a requirement, or something like that. But it's also true that, what you learn is that, this material really does speak to everybody. It's not, it's not somehow, obscure or recherche, or, I mean, this, I'm sure, from your own, experiences teaching and reading with other people. Of course you do. And so it's, I would say probably the biggest difference in a way, Sarah, was maybe how much the Odyssey meant to them. It wasn't just an adventure and a kind of, complicated, narrative and so on and so forth. But it really was a story about how to, in part, what home is, what it, can you go home again, and so forth, and what happens after all these years. So that was, and then another thing I think is that older students have, and I found this in teaching older students, elsewhere too. I mean, certain things just have, for instance, something like Oedipus the King, I mean, the idea that you might learn something about yourself that you don't want to know. I mean, 18-year-olds don't think that there's anything about themselves that isn't wonderful, and that, they don't, that you wouldn't want to know, and so forth. But it's, it's different later on. Helen is asking, did they end with some of the heroes, and did they have a favorite one? I do think they had a lot of, interest in Odysseus, and they had a lot of sympathy for Ajax. Mm-hmm. They had a lot of sympathy for Ajax. And in a way, one of the things that we sort of oriented the class, the tragedy class, around in terms of questions that we were asking. And here's the thing, Sarah, where if I think it's the next, maybe it's the next slide on that. Let's see. It's if you just go down a little bit. Yeah. So, libation bearers, when Clytemnestra, Orestes is finally confronting Clytemnestra, and Clytemnestra, is pleading with him and, showing her breast and saying, no, you can't do this. Don't you remember, I nursed you as a child and so forth. And this, as we thought about it, kind of pivotal line where Orestes says, what shall I do? What shall I do, Pylades? And to think about, where in these plays, the question of what shall I do was either explicit or implicit. And so, we talked about, the way the plays dramatize, problems of choice and responsibility, and so forth. And so, so that question of what shall I do was something that came back, in the discussions often. And I think let me see if what the next slide gives. Oh, yes. So just, when, and just down again at the bottom, all these things are at the bottom of the page. Yeah, when Orestes, does come to the moment of killing his mother, and he says to her, you killed and it was wrong, now suffer wrong. And the fact that he knew, he knows that what he's doing is wrong. He doesn't say, I'm right to do this. He knows he's wrong. That is to say, it's wrong to commit matricide. And so this was also something that we talked about a lot. That is the kind of moral, as it were, consciousness, and the sense that the sense that Orestes, even though he was doing what he had to do, was going to suffer also. So this was something that we spent some time thinking about. What does tragedy offer in the way of a kind of exploration of choice, and of responsibility and responsible action and so forth. Sorry, that some of the material may legitimize violence and vengeance, and as in Aeschylus. Well, I think, yeah, it's a good question. It didn't seem to have that, to register that way with him, and maybe partly because also the plays make clear the costs of violence, and the Eumenides, the last play in the trilogy, which has the court scene, and so forth, and Athena founding the court, and the idea that that, I mean, we spent a lot of time on this, the sort of the difference between, vengeance and, retribution and so forth on the one hand, and justice, on the other, and the standards, the ethical standards of the community. And so there was there was quite a lot of discussion of that. So it's a good question, though. Bill has a question.
Yeah, and I'll switch to gallery view here now that we're getting more into the question and answer kind of thing here. Okay, here's everyone. Yeah, Bill, do you want to just go ahead and speak out your question?
Yeah, I was wondering what kind of critiques you got for future classes from the students, and also what other Homeric material they responded to in a way that might have surprised you.
What other
Material from Homer that they respond to that in a way that might have surprised you, and what suggestions they have for future classes?
Yeah, I think the the answer to sort of how they responded to the class as a whole, maybe their notes that they gave us at the end would give some sense of. I think the thing I might think about for future classes is what we did at the very end, in the very last class, session of the tragedy class. We had Ellen McLaughlin, whose play they had read, come with us to the class. She was very generous, and agreed to come and talk to the students. And of course, they were absolutely thrilled. And what we asked them to do in advance was to prepare a kind of reading of, we asked them, and we sort of divided them into pairs and asked them to prepare kind of reading. And some of them, couple of them did something from the Fugard play, but most of them did Ellen McLaughlin's play, and she was wonderful about responding to their performance, as it were. And I think what I would want to do in the future is have more kinds of projects like that, where they actually, as it were, performed something, but the other thing is that, part of our effort was to help them with their writing in these weekly papers, and that is a very demanding. That's a very demanding business, and there are some writing classes as part of the program, but you could see some people were natural writers. I mean, there was not much sense of what a paper is, or and a lot of kind of limitations of grammar and just kind of expository technique. I mean, they really need a tremendous amount of help with that. And I think probably, I mean, we didn't teach this as a writing class, but I think probably some more help with that would be beneficial, in whatever class. And I think, I think what Bill is asking about what else they responded to. I mean, I think they really felt the sort of power of um, of the Homeric poems throughout. I mean, I think the Iliad was very, was deeply affecting to them, and they, um, I don't think. I mean, there was a certain amount, and this is, when Sarah was saying, well, how is this different from ordinary undergraduates? I mean, people often start out with a kind of moralizing reading of these things, and this idea that, um, there's a sort of conventional sense of, uh, what you should and shouldn't do, and Achilles as, all this stuff about, Achilles as, I don't know, spoiled or selfish or something or another, or um, and but then, as they really got into it, they were able to move away from that. I mean, there is a certain amount of stuff that, um, yeah, of a kind of, sort of moralizing, preachy stuff. But I mean, undergraduates have that too, about people's behavior and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. But they really got into the, the poem and understood that there was an ethic there that was not about, church going and so forth. And that was very, heartening to see. I'm just going to look at the chat for a second.
Yeah, there's a beautiful question from Claudia there that I wonder, could I get you,
Claudia,
to
how nice to see Claudia.
speak it out? Or I can read it here.
Yes.
Say that? Yeah, go for it.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Okay, Claudia says, you've written eloquently about figures in moments of power and powerlessness. Did these classes engage with these concepts? And how, if at all, did this impact your reading of these themes?
Yeah. Claudia, will you teach this with us the next time we teach it? I think this is a wonderful question. I'm gonna get you guys in there with us, Sarah and Bill and Claudia and all of you. We can all do it together. You can come the way Ellen McLaughlin came. Oh, I think that's a wonderful question. And yes, I mean, there, there was a kind of through line always about justice and about the difficulty of sort of getting access to it, and powerlessness in that sense was part of it. But I think you're right, Claudia, in a way that was a sort of underlying thread, that the sort of disparity between, and sometimes they were very explicit about, sometimes they talked about their own experiences. I mean, when we met with them for the first time, we asked them, certain things about what they like to read, what they like to watch, and so. But you can't go in and say, hi, what are you in for? I mean, you can't ask them what it is that they're in there for. And on the whole, they don't talk about it. But sometimes, sometimes they did. And by and large, they when they talked about it, they talked about their own responsibility, but also about about a kind of, a sort of situation that they didn't see a way out of. There's one guy in there who was very bright, who had actually had I think a year of college somewhere. And these were all, I should say, these were 99. I think we had one white student, two white students between the two classes, so these were all people of color. And they talked about how, limited, possibilities had been for them. And I remember this one guy who was very bright and as I say, had some higher education. And he said, he really, it's not that, he was interested in drugs, he wasn't, and so on and so forth. But the only opportunity that he had to, to make money and to be able to get out of the environment he was in had been to get involved with drugs, which I took to mean selling them. And and he said he just, he couldn't see, and he was a guy with a little kid and so forth. And he didn't see other, there weren't other real openings for him. So questions about powerlessness, I think, in a way underpinned a lot. But again, I mean, no one said, I was, done, I was done too badly or something. Nobody blamed anybody else, and people didn't, on the whole, so to speak, blame the system. They were, they were pretty critical of the federal administration, but they didn't, it wasn't a kind of, it wasn't a sense that they felt, they'd been had or something like that. So they were all absolutely, I mean, those who sort of talked about it, were willing to, to talk about their own role and what had happened to them. Jennifer,
I wonder if we're getting over time here, so maybe
I'm
this
sorry.
can be our.
Let me just show
Oh
you
no,
the.
I'm not holding you responsible
So
for
sorry.
that in any way.
Maybe
But
I'll just
this
show
is
you
an
these
interesting
last
question
slides.
here. If you were to bring this program to a women's correctional facility, would you have a different approach? Perhaps focus on different passages.
Keith, sorry
Oh.
for going in.
Mhm.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Because my question also is very is relating with Jennifer Coles, the one that you just read, and because I was about also to ask almost the same question about the future of the program and whether Laura sees it especially taking place in a woman's correctional facility. And I'm saying this because from my experience, I had the opportunity, to teach via by remote access to two different people, one man and one woman in correctional facilities. And in a way, I understood that, yes, in a way, how shall I call it? Gender reflects different kinds of learning styles. So would you like to talk more about this and combine the two questions? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think what Jennifer is asking, and suggesting about focusing on different things and teaching different passages. I think absolutely. but I mean, I would love to hear your experience, Maria, because I haven't taught women in you know, in this kind of context. But I can imagine,
Well,
uh, yeah,
my
I can
experience was
imagine that one would
yeah,
do
well,
some things quite differently.
the woman that I taught was also in a high security correctional facility in Greece. So you could have imagined in a way the background. However, we got along really well because my focus was on supporting her learning process. Okay, so I contacted her via phone because they also had no access to computer, or once they sent me, only when she used to send me emails. Of course, she was supervised. I must say that it was really amazing to see how committed she was.
Absolutely, yeah,
Absolutely, she was very committed.
yeah,
Although
yeah,
access, as you said, access was limited to online sources, and she followed the course with great interest, and she submitted all her
yeah,
assessments,
yeah,
which
absolutely.
were, and which were quite. I must say they took place very often. The assessments via like an essay, so it was a written work. Now, with the men, it was different because what I realized, and maybe I would like to ask you to comment on this via your experience, is that in a way he tried to, whenever he wrote an assessment, this reflected also his personal experiences in his dealings with the law, with the penal law, and
Yeah,
the they were written in a more sentimental way. Um, but still he managed. I must say he was also committed, but he let's say his sentiments, his emotions out in his writing style. I don't know whether this is often or not.
yes, I think there was, I mean, it was a mix, but certainly some did. I mean, that's perfectly true. That we got, um, you know, we got a sense of that, you know, from some of the students. But I think that, yes, I mean, I think what you're describing, Maria, um, about commitment and about a kind of, um, you know, a sort of sense of, if you had this too, a sort of sense of we're in this together sort of thing, you know, and that's, you know, they didn't at the end of the hour, they didn't all want to leave, you know, they wanted to stay and talk more, you know, unlike undergraduate students who are, you know, it's like, where is lunch, you know, and so forth. So yeah, no, I would certainly be interested, just to say that there is a volume that's going to come out. Emilio Capitini and Nancy Rabinowitz at Santa Barbara are doing a volume of essays on teaching classics in prison that I think is going to come out, I don't know, later in the year or something like that. Amy and I have a little contribution in there, and I think people who have taught in other you know, in other you know, prison situations, including women's prisons, will be represented there. So that might be interesting to look at. I'd love to show you, just before I let you go, just those next couple of slides, because in our last class, the students gave us they gave Amy and me these notes that they had written for us. And they had a,
And so one of them drew this, I take it, as well.
sorry?
And this drawing was
Yeah,
produced by one of them.
it wasn't someone in the class. They had asked somebody else, one of their friends in the facility, who was an artist, to do these drawings. And so this is what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 in the afternoon. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of their notes. You could just run through. Yeah, you can. I don't know if you can see some of these. Let's see.
I know that you chose some out. They're in the last slide.
Yeah, on the last slide, you can. So if you want to just run through, Sarah, run through the next, the one before this, and then the one after this. Yes, this was another drawing that they did. You see, here's Tragoidea and Athena. He had copied the Greek, and then the next, and then the one after that, I think, has some of the. So yeah. So you can see some of the. Thank you for turning my foolishness into understanding the meaning of the world in which we live. As I thought of giving up on my education, this course was the reason that a decision for me to continue was made. Right? By him. You know, the decision was made by him. I've learned so much about myself and also about Greek because Greek mythology is relevant to society today. And so forth. Yes, this is the one that was very charming to us. To the 2 wonderful women that enlighten us to understand Greek tragedy, which at first I was like, what? And then the helpful feedback that you give us guys is very helpful. Keep up the good work. And so forth. And then this last one, by this wonderful guy, the one who left the Bronx so as not to go back into the gang. And he writes in the final comment, "You open my world to a new place and help me to find a new way to use my voice in this world, and seeing that some battles that were fought in the past are the same today." Right? So
Wow.
Amy and I felt that we could say the same thing. If you teach in prison, it will open your world. I'm sure, Maria, you felt that with your students too.
I think what you do is really important from many aspects and many perspectives.
Yeah. So, so thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for
listening.
Thank you for sharing your experiences and through those notes, sharing some of their experience as well. So, all right, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Claudia, so great to see you. Claudia was my first guide in the open house. That was 5 years ago, right, Claudia?
Thank you. It was lovely to see you. It was such a beautiful discussion. I'm really touched by